Benson, Warwickshire County Council. So, manual for streets we utilise on a daily basis for our residential developments, but we've got an issue with our fire and rescue services that we're having to put bigger and wider roads in to enable fire and rescue services to get in, especially blocks of flats, because we have to get in platform units. We therefore tell developers they need to have wider than standard roads. They want 5 metres. We're pushing them at 6.1 for a community spine in. I suppose in Manual for Streets, is there a plan to give greater control in terms of the dimensions which will be expected for residential developments, as well as points of access for scales of development? Because at the moment, it doesn't really give us that tool. It's very much in the developer's hand and sometimes works against the highway authority. Just a thought.
No, I think the short answer is no. I'm reminded that a colleague of mine, a guy called Rob Cowan, when he does these sort of presentations, he has a slide where there's a 7.3 or 6 metre wide carriageway, 2 metre wide footways. There's a car parked, there's a van parked, the dustbin wagon's coming through, and he's superimposed a fire engine on it. And of course that means you need, a 12 metre wide carriageway. And at some point in time, you've got to you can't cater for every and any eventuality under every circumstance. So whether you include, overrun strips to get some of your heavier vehicles in, whether you argue that they can get so far, I really don't know. But the Manual for Streets isn't going to turn around and say, in order to get a fire engine in, you have to have this sort of width. It'll give you the. Let me just go back a step. There was a time when guidance was prescriptive. Stopping distances, visibility distances, widths, footway widths, and Manual for Streets moved away from that, particularly in respect of the first two. And what we said was, designers ought to be thinking for themselves because every situation is different. So you can include a set of criteria, a set of concepts, I guess, but you can and principles is perhaps the best way of putting it. You can include those set of principles, but then you entrust the individual who's doing the design and liaising between all those people you've just talked about who are difficult. And I've worked with developers, and I know what you mean. I'm sorry for any developers who are here. But then you've got to, for each individual circumstance, I think you can only apply those principles as best you can and seek a way through. That Better Streets report we talked about was about inclusivity. Now one person's inclusive environment is another person's problem. A wheelchair user doesn't want any upstands. A blind person does. And it's a similar sort of concept when you talk about the needs of a dustbin wagon and a fire engine and so on and so forth. So you'll never get away with 3 metre wide carriageways, but you might get away with 5.5. But it will depend on your circumstance. And to answer your question, no is the answer. Manual for Streets will not give you a prescriptive answer to that question. Sorry. That's your job.
Okay, anybody else? There we go. Up to the mouth.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, I work for County Council. The problem we seem to get, Manual for Streets, is especially when you're dealing with developers, they pick bits out of it that suit their causes and leave other bits alone. Especially, we have a lot of problems with that type of thing, where they're quite happy to use reduced visibility, but other things in terms of when you're trying to get a better, more inclusive site, that they still like to use traditional house building methods, how they like their units, they still prefer cul-de-sacs, and it's quite hard to change their attitude in terms of that. And the second part, I suppose, is from our point of view in terms of there's always been, and we've always had this issue in terms of, as a highway authority, is the issue of maintaining a lot of what goes in terms of the materials. Because obviously using some fancy materials, block paving and the likes, comes with its own inherent risk, especially where you're getting skewing manoeuvres and things like that. That gives us an issue where we've already got, a very tight highways maintenance budget, and they're very reluctant to move away from materials that don't last the test, don't last past sort of 10 years or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Manual for Streets won't give you any help with specification of materials. Manual for Streets talks about local highway authorities Yeah. But
It is about placemaking, and a lot of the planners and your urban designers out there, obviously the urban realm is a lot of that in terms of materials, and they massively pushing for a change in that, to come away from a concrete curb, tarmac footway and a tarmac road.
yeah, and there's a middle ground, and the middle ground as far as materials is concerned is what you as the development control officer and the developer need to understand and find that middle ground. I mean, we've all come across situations, I have in particular, where architect specified materials which have been inappropriate for the use on a highway and which are unmaintainable because they're not replaceable have been used, and they create a big problem. On the other hand, I went to Berlin a couple of years ago, and there are 4 materials on every street in Berlin. The whole of Berlin then was just paved with 4 materials. You know? But going back to Manual for Streets will not include any sort of prescriptive recommendation about materials. You know, that's up to you guys. But what Manual for Streets does say is that the local highway authority should build on Manual for Streets and prepare, publish, make available its own interpretation to apply its local standards to their local environment. It's not dissimilar to the conversation over here about, you know, being specific to the place and the area and the region. I come from Yorkshire. There's lots of Yorkstone around. You know, Yorkstone costs a lot of money if you want to put it into Redruth in Cornwall or somewhere. You know, so it's got to be appropriate for the place. It's got to be appropriate for the application, and it's got to be maintainable. I couldn't agree more. But I think that's something that you can build into your local highway authority design guide, not Manual for Streets. You need the mic again. You're going to carry on.
I wasn't trying to sort of make that. Obviously, you know, we have got a design guide, and the materials are a separate specification at the back of it. I think the point I was trying to make is what we get a lot, and a lot of planning people in terms of urban designers and such, they see a lot of the urban realm and placemaking as putting in things, like you say, they use a lot of materials that we struggle to maintain.
Yeah.
And through that process, you know, we're always seen as the bad people, because we'll say, yeah, we're fine to use it, but you realise a non-standard material is going to attract a commuted sum. So by the time you add that up at the end of the job, and they, you know, if they go down the line of a viability report and somebody's asked for an uplift in the public realm, you know, and then we're asking for £100,000 plus, say, for trees and materials, it's sort of, you know, it can affect that process.
You have my sympathy, and I've spent a career trying to get planners and engineers to understand each other. You can only deal with that issue by understanding each other and by applying the standards rigorously and insisting the developers follow that. But the developer will always seek to get the best interpretation from them, and vice versa. That's why the development control engineer has to be really skillful. But you're not going to solve that problem with Manual for Streets. I'm sorry.
Sorry, guy. Just sort of add to Peter's comments and just pick up on that and the point about prescription as well. One of the key findings that came out of the Cabinet Office work that the Policy Lab did was that almost without exception, the sort of approach that Manual for Streets takes was seen as really, really positive. The bad thing was that it wasn't being used consistently across the country, and that was the issue that the Cabinet Office and DFT and the Ministry, I think, are now taking very, very seriously. They realise that this issue about prescription, as everything, it moves in cycles. So Manual for Streets 1 was a DFT document. Manual for Streets 2 was a CIHT publication that DFT supported. And that was at a time when DFT were trying to push away the responsibility, in a way, of who calls the shots. Manual for Streets 3, or whatever it ends up being called, I think there's a view that it's very clear that has to be mandated by government. So to help you address the question about a developer wants to pick and choose, Well, actually, no, because its use is mandated. Peter's right in what you say about prescription of the design within that will always be, it's for the designer to come with a decision. The important thing is that it's used across the country, and that's what will change, I think, with Manual for Streets 3. So I think that's the really positive thing, that the ministry, the planning side and the highway side are tied in together now on this, and that's a big step. So
I wasn't going to say that because I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but I think that's something to work towards, to make it more mandatory, to give you that help. Okay. Any more? Yes, lady here.
Going back to your point about place and measuring of place, have you used any of the indicators from the Healthy Streets indicators? Is that useful for you?
I had to go over there to hear what you were saying through the speaker, I'm sorry. The answer is yes. We've the guys who are working on that little bit of a project have picked up on the Healthy Streets work, and there are other people who have done similar work as well. So we're hoping that we can build on all of that in such a way that it will be useful to the audience and the constituency that we're addressing. We don't want, I'm choosing my words clumsily here, but we don't want this to be overly prescriptive, and we don't want it to be veering towards any particular group. I've said already that different users of the highway have different perspectives about what the highway should and the place should consist of. But the answer to your question is yes, we're aware of that, and we've used it, and it's in the documentation that's being put together as we speak.